by definition work. So the idea that you can impose a top-down solution to enable economic transactions is just wrong. And people who could have taken India in a completely different direction in terms of our economics and therefore our politics in the 1950s, these three names more people should know about. Absolutely. I would argue one thing that holds us back as a society and a culture is we have a very zero-sum mindset. मेरे को जीतने के लिए तेरे को हारना जरूरी है.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Inductive Economy, a podcast where we delve into the intersection of technology, economics, policy, and progress. I'm your host Vignesh Swaminathan, and we have a distinguished guest who is not only an accomplished economist but a passionate educator. Joining us today is Ashish Kulkarni, an economist with a unique perspective that transcends traditional boundaries. Ashish is the creator of Economics for Everybody, a platform dedicated to making economics accessible to everyone. With a background deeply rooted in the study of economic principles, he brings a wealth of knowledge and a knack for breaking down complex ideas into digestible insights. In our conversation, we explored the intriguing concept of state capacity libertarianism, a thought-provoking approach that challenges conventional notions of the role of the state in the economy. Ashish shed light on the importance of understanding this perspective and its implications for shaping economic policies. Our conversation takes us through the intricate dance of price floors and ceilings, discussing their impact on markets and the broader economy. Ashish shares valuable insights into the complexities of these economic mechanisms and their consequences on various stakeholders. We also discuss the 6 core ideas from economics Ashish believes everyone should be taught or made aware of to live better lives and understand economics better. Lastly, we explore the fascinating intersection of voter preferences and economic choices. Ashish delves into the compatibility of these two crucial aspects of our societal structure, offering a nuanced perspective on the interplay between democracy and economic decision-making at an individual level. Get ready for a captivating discussion that traverses the realms of economics, education, and societal dynamics. Without further ado, I bring you Ashish Kulkarni.
So, Ashish, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me on this episode of the Inductive Economy. Super duper excited that you're here with us, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this. Let's go.
Awesome. So, Ashish, before we dive into the meat of the matter, if you could quickly just give a quick biography to our listeners. I will obviously do a part of it also at the start of the episode, but from your own words and your own experiences, if you could just sum up your life and career so far, it will be very helpful to start.
Sure. My career has effectively been an attempt at not planning one. I'm an engineering dropout. Then I landed up in economics purely by accident, and I'm happy to get into how that accident happened. One thing led to the other, and I'm still not clear how, but I ended up earning a PhD in economics. I have had stints in the corporate world. I've worked with Genpact, Fidelity, and Suzlon. But apart from that, the focus of my career has been teaching. From around 2013 until this last year, all I did was teach, whether on a part-time basis or on a full-time basis. And helping people understand the magic of economics and how it is applicable both to their lives and the world at large is pretty much what I want to spend the rest of my life on.
Awesome. So let's get to the first topic that you touched on. So how did you find your path into economics?
So, Three Idiots wali kahani hai. My dad wanted me to be an engineer. I wanted to be anything but an engineer. It still is a field that I admire it now, but still fills me with a little bit of fear. I dropped out of engineering at the end of my first semester examination, and I wanted to be a writer. But having won the battle, I lost the war. So I managed to convince my dad that I should be leaving engineering. But he said, "Chalo theek hai, ab naak katwa hi rahe ho, to at least do something respectable if you are going to do a Bachelor of Arts degree." And economics was seen as being quote unquote respectable.
Yeah.
And so that's how I ended up in economics.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. So my first question to you is, when did you come across Tyler Cowen's essay called State Capacity Libertarianism?
I read Marginal Revolution pretty much every day, not literally every day, but if I'm working, then I have to read Marginal Revolution. That's a given.
Yeah.
And as my wife and my daughter will point out, even if I'm not working, I might still end up reading Marginal Revolution.
Yeah.
So must have been pretty much the day that he wrote the essay, or maximum 1 or 2 days afterwards.
And when you read it,
Mhm.
what did you feel like? What went through your mind after you finished reading it?
Well, I mean, I can't say for sure now, but two things must have happened. One, a sense of amazement that somebody like Tyler would write an essay called State Capacity Libertarianism. I have always identified Tyler as being part of the libertarian movement rather than anything associated with state capacity or state in general. So, in a sense, the an amazement that he would say something like this. And second, on reflection, if anybody on the libertarian side would have said something like this, it could only have been Tyler.
Yeah.
What defines him is not being libertarian as much as being contrarian.
Yeah.
And so, on reflection, my system to brain would have said, of course, it's inevitable that somebody like Tyler would have come up with this phrase.
So when I also remember reading it, and I remember putting it back because that was the time I was sort of, I have always been a very openly libertarian person. I
Hmm.
don't talk my politics out loud like most people, but I keep my libertarian views to myself because most of the time I tried that in college briefly. So my tryst with it came when Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 came out,
Right.
and then you start digging because whole book was wild if you really think about it.
Oh, yes.
And I was like in my second year or third year of college, and my mind was blown completely. Who's this guy? What does he believe? Why does he believe these things? Why does he believe that the world is not what you see? And or why progress has slowed down and stuff like that. Then I found the entire coterie of people who are
Hmm.
associated with Peter, and that is how I found out about Tyler.
Oh, lovely.
And
Okay.
and it stood out to me because I remember putting it down and sitting back and thinking, "Yeah, what chal kya raha hai?" That was my first feeling. And then when I began reading this Great Stagnation, I'll connect this Great Stagnation and state capacity libertarianism within the context of India. We'll talk
Right.
about 91, etc. But
Uh,
the COVID really showed that the Great Stagnation is actually true to a certain extent. Now you will say that any rational person might say that look, warp speed worked. The
right.
capacity is still there within the state. But the point of the capacity is to ensure that these sort of breakouts don't really happen. They are actually marginal or outlier events, right? And not such a global sort of a distributed attack on certain pivotal systems and a complete fracture in decision making, right?
Mhm.
Uh, when you take this into consideration, where do you think that? My first question to you is: do you think there is a sense of stagnation in Indian science and economic policy?
Uh, yes, for the most part. And best explained through counterfactuals. We could and should have done a lot more. So it's not so much about stagnation in terms of what we have achieved. Two ways of looking at it. You can see where we are 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago and compare where we are now. And from that perspective, sure, we've done a fair bit. In fact, in terms of economic development, 1991 to 2023 has been amazing. No
Correct.
two ways about it. But the question to ask isn't how amazing it has been, but to ask how amazing it could have been. And from that perspective, I would say not only is there a long way to go, but we could and should have done much better. So from that perspective, yes, not done as much as we should have.
Agreed. Now, when I read the state capacity essay,
Hmm.
it was actually very, very in the Neti Neti style of Indian philosophy, where he was actually saying it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this.
Yep,
So when you so to a person who has so people who are listening to this, please go read Tyler Cowen's essay. It's
absolutely.
absolutely incredible because it opens your thinking about a lot of things.
Yep,
So I'm not holding you as a proxy to Tyler. I think that would be very, very unfair. But
extremely.
but let me ask you that for a long time, public discourse on economics has always been that I'm either somewhat of a statist to a certain extent, or I'm somebody who prefers the maternal sort of state coming in and looking after me,
Yep,
versus somebody who's always been like, yeah, it should be a small state, मेरे को अकेला छोड़ो, okay,
hmm.
and बस corruption साफ करो and stuff like that, okay. Uh, where does state capacity? My first question is, where does state capacity libertarianism fall within these poles? And B, does it even fall in these poles, or is it a separate way of thinking altogether?
I would say it falls within these poles. I'm very fond of a phrase that I often use while writing on my blog. I say the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. And so
Yeah.
therefore extreme solutions on either side don't make sense. Me personally, I would argue that markets by definition work. So the idea that you can impose a top-down solution to enable economic transactions is just wrong. And so therefore, whether it is communism, whether it is socialism, it just doesn't work. No two ways about it. So if anything, if you want to think along the spectrum, and I'm not trying to put words into Tyler's mouth, but I would think he thinks along somewhat similar lines. On the spectrum, you would want to lie closer towards libertarianism, but an extreme form of libertarianism simply does not work.
Agreed.
Why does it not work? It might be because of market failures, which in my opinion are real. It might be because you need the government to enforce at least certain things. It might be because under certain circumstances, you need the government to intervene. One of my favorite lines to have read over the last 3 years was even Alex Tabarrok says that there is a role for government. I'm blanking on the exact line right now, but he said something to the effect of even I, one time out of 100, will say that there is a role for government. And so therefore, I think the framework works. And within that framework, an extreme solution is unlikely. Support markets, but acknowledge the need for government is the best way that I can think of describing it in simple terms.
Within this context, there's always a dilemma between the state's capacity building initiatives
Right.
and the public's general freedom.
Yep.
Right. There is always a sense of intervention. There is always a sense of we are doing X, Y, Z, so you should be able to comply or be something like that, right? So, where does state capacity libertarianism fall in this argument? What is its approach? What is its take? And how is it different from the current models that we have on we are building capacity, so you have to be okay with a certain loss of freedom? Or is my framing even incorrect? I will leave it even more open ended.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. I wouldn't say incorrect. Perhaps through this conversation, or maybe later on, we can try and figure out what framing would be best. Instinctively, whether it is people like you and I, whether it is people who, broadly speaking, support markets more than they do government, I would argue what we should try and do is say that, all right, a market based framework is the correct way, but with a role for government. We owe it to ourselves, and especially those of us who want to think about this, we owe it to ourselves, society today and society in the future, to guard against government getting too much of a role. There is always an opportunity cost. When you have government, by definition, the opportunity cost is going to have to be some sort of sacrifice of freedom. How to minimize it as much as possible, while at the same time making sure that markets are able to function as well as they can, is to me a framework. I hesitate to use the word framework because I haven't really defined one, but that's how I'm most comfortable thinking about this right now.
Right. And as a follow up, given that the state has sort of always expanded its role in
Yeah.
specific sectors,
Yes.
what are your views on taxation and resource allocation to support this quote unquote framework?
We haven't, I think, found a way around it just yet. Trust me, I'm not a fan of taxation. None of us are. Every time you end up paying effectively 3 months of your annual income to the government, dukta hai. Matlab, I can't tell you the kind of pain that all of us experience. But I don't think we have found a better way to fund government activity just yet. Tabarrok's idea, and I'm happy to talk about this in greater detail if you like, about dominant assurance contracts, is one of the better ideas that I've heard of. But I don't think it has been operationalized to the extent that it should have been by now. So no, I don't think we have a way around taxes just yet.
Yeah, I'll be open. I'm talking to you as a friend. Okay, you even bring up the idea of dominant assurance contracts to our policymakers. They'll throw their hands up. They will run out and they will say, burn whoever is the guy who got Alex Tabarrok to talk to us about implementing this. You are laughing because you know it is true.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yes.
Why is that?
Lots of reasons. The biggest one is A, inertia, and B, what is the incentive for a bureaucrat or a policymaker to say, hey, you know what, let's try and change this. काम करा तो ज्यादा तो मिलने वाला है नहीं और काम नहीं किया तो वाट लगने वाली है. So why take the risk?
That was actually going to be my next question, which is if
Mhm.
you want to impose dominant assurance contracts, okay,
Yeah.
what should be the incentives? Okay, first this is a great experiment. I'm just having a little bit of fun.
Hmm.
To implement this, who do
Right.
you think are the stakeholders? Okay. B, what should be their incentives?
How to promote risk taking by bureaucrats is a great question to ask.
The
None of us have
timeless
been able to
question.
figure out exactly.
The timeless question.
And honestly, I don't think the answer lies in setting up incentives. The answer lies in setting up a culture of excellence and meritocracy. To use empirics, if you take a look at the world today and ask which country comes closest to what we are talking about, which country is likeliest to implement dominant assurance contracts today. And in my opinion, the only answer likely is Singapore. Then the question to ask is not about what economic principles they've used to design incentives better, but what is it about the culture of Singapore that allows the kind of bureaucrats that emerge over there? And to use a very Tylerian take, I think the answer lies in the culture of Singapore rather than it does in the economics that or the economic principle that Singapore uses.
Yeah. So, just as a follow up to that, there's always this discussion about the size versus the structure of any economy, right?
Yep.
Uh, I think India. So there is a really good article that came out a couple of months ago about India having brandless growth, right?
Hmm.
Like we are getting a lot of stuff done, but there are no Googles or Microsofts or Apples that are actually coming out of India. Okay,
Yep.
almost like it's again the recent Narayan Murthy comment that young
70
Indians
घंटे.
have to 70 घंटे काम करना है. It came with a certain degree of backlash. That I think Abhijit Iyer Mitra went on record saying that this is exactly why we are the coolies of the world or the back offices of the Western world. Okay, all that aside, my point that I'm trying to basically make is that problem is always in somewhat identifying the incentive. Okay,
Yeah.
because Munger always says that show me the incentive, I will show you the outcome. Okay,
Correct.
and I'm asking about size versus structure because we have always prioritized for size over structure. Okay, you tied to the culture point. Okay,
Yeah.
so my question is that if you are trying to grow to say not a China but a South Korea, okay, and you want to avoid being a Thailand, I'm setting the case very very clear.
Absolutely.
If your goal to grow, then you have to. If your goal is to grow, then you have to assess how Thailand grew and stagnated, how
Yep.
China is growing. Now there is an argument even on China on whether it is on a hiatus or whether it is on a downturn. That is a different problem altogether. And
Yep.
what is rarely spoken about is South Korea. Okay,
Yep.
we need to hit 35,000 GDP per capita is my view.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep. Yep.
now the South Korean economy is structured in such a way was actually structured in such a way during the early days in the 60s, etc., to be able to have a scaffolding for that growth. Okay, now how do we take ideas like dominant assurance contracts, state capacity libertarianism to actually expand that structure to be able to withhold all that growth, and because we have a young demographic.
Yeah.
See, my view is that Narayan Murthy's comment was not about doing 70 hours of coolie work. Okay,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
70 hours of doing work for yourself. Go out, build your startup. Go out, build your dreams. Okay,
Yeah.
but that's the effort it's going to take at a bare minimum. Okay, now my question to you is, how do you build the scaffolding using an idea like dominant assurance contracts, state capacity libertarianism, etc.?
Okay, this is going to be a very long answer because there are many different things that I want to touch upon. Feel free to both interrupt me or stop me whenever you like.
Absolutely.
The first thing I'll begin with is culture in South Korea. So, two books that I'm going to refer to. One is a book called The Miracle by Michael Schumann, and the other is a book called How Asia Works by Joe Studwell. Both are fantastic books to read if you want to understand what sets apart, in the case of How Asia Works, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan from other Asian economies. This is not going to please any Indian listening to this, but according to Joe Studwell, the ASEAN nations are the failures in Asia. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are the successes. India doesn't even make it to the list of failures. Now, when it comes to South Korea, they did not focus on state capacity libertarianism in the 50s and the 60s. In fact, they focused only on state capacity.
Exactly.
Lovely story. I can't remember where it comes from. is about how prominent industrialists in South Korea were rounded up by General Park soon after he became
The
the de facto
chaebols,
dictator. The chaebol, the heads of the chaebols, yes.
the heads
They,
of the chaebols.
they were rounded up and thrown in jail. You might ask why, and the answer was no particular crime. They were kept there for a while, and then they were taken out, and they were told, you either do what we tell you to do, or you go back in jail. Now, forget libertarianism. This goes against any established norm in any civil society.
Correct.
But General Park's take was this is what is needed. And so, therefore, he focused more on state capacity than he did on libertarianism. Coming to your second point about how to avoid the stagnation that one sees in Thailand and one does not see in South Korea, a question that I love to ask foreigners is name one thing in your home that has been manufactured by an Indian company, a mixer grinder, a lamp, a television, whatever it may be. And pretty soon people realize that it's quite likely that no such thing exists.
Yeah.
This goes back to your earlier point about how we never focused on homegrown brands and India being, in a sense, brandless growth. It's not just the large tech firms that you referred to. We don't have good manufacturing champions the world over.
Correct.
Thailand optimized for FDI. They optimize for getting firms from other countries to locate themselves in Thailand. South Korea said it doesn't matter how long it takes and it doesn't matter what needs to be done. We will have domestic champions become export leaders. So it took Hyundai decades, literally, to break into the American market. But today, a Hyundai car is seen as a sign of quality. And again, people might be amazed to understand this, but in the 1950s, I was born in only 1982, but I've read that in the 1950s, sasta Japanese mal used to be a derogatory term. जैसे आजकल हम लोग कहते हैं सस्ता Chinese mal.
Yeah.
So Japan graduated into being seen as a hallmark of quality. So did South Korea. And today you could argue about how successful it is, but China is doing the same thing. What India has not been able to do is it has not been able to use its state capacity in order to be able to develop global champions. And if you want to go down the South Korea route and ask how we reached $35,000, turns out it's actually something that you would perhaps not want to do because of the route that whether it is Japan, whether it is South Korea, they adopted. But a significant strand of development literature seems to suggest that there is no alternative. In your path of development, you're going to have government take a leading role, except the leading role is one of Darwinian capitalism.
Yeah.
Which means, hey, you provide all the production-linked incentives that you want to use a uniquely Indian phrase right now, but also use the incentive of the stick along with the carrot.
Correct.
मतलब पैसा दो, ठीक है, लो और करो तुमको जो करना है, नहीं कर पाए तो भैया डंडा पड़ने वाला है. That second part we have always missed. So sure, we don't have libertarianism. Our tragedy is we don't even have state capacity. We have only half of it. We provide the incentives, but only the positive ones, not the negative ones. And that's what allows companies in India to either skirt the rules or make sure that they enter into some kind of oligopolistic cozy-up arrangement with the government. And I'm not referring to anything that's happening only now, throughout Indian history. And unfortunately, we have suffered as a consequence. So we have neither state capacity nor libertarianism. And unfortunately, we end up with the worst of all worlds.
And I completely agree, because when you take the notion of a market that works,
Yeah.
and you take into consideration that you have people who are capitalists. The capitalists, the markets have to work in symphony to produce outcomes of prosperity for
Yep.
the population. The problem with India is that it is so entrenched with notions of socialism and crony capitalism. It's very hard to remove the locusts off
Yep.
the ship to even sort of repair it in the first place.
Exactly.
Now, how do you, in your view, how do you remove those locusts? How do you disentangle this to ensure that you have to be able to think properly about growing this forward?
It comes down again to that old word, culture. To come back to another point that was raised in Joe Studwell's book, when POSCO, the famous South Korean firm, was established in South Korea, the day on which it was established is, I think, even today celebrated as National Steel Day, which is a national holiday. Here's the weird bit. The holiday means you end up working for longer. So it's not as if you celebrate a national holiday by staying at home. You celebrate a national holiday, celebrate is the wrong word, but you end up going to your workplace and working for even longer. You can take offense or umbrage at Murthy's remark. And as a fundamentally lazy person, I'm tempted to sure. But note the word he's used is should work, not must work. He's not
Yeah.
establishing a law. He's saying, look, other countries that have established this path of development have walked the walk. You're going to have to walk the walk. If you choose to not work for 14 hours, great. But if you want India to be a global leader, you have to be able to figure out how to produce more by paying people less. That's just a simple fundamental economics. When I say paying people less, I don't mean paying them less than the wage rate, but efficiency is creating as much as possible by using your inputs as efficiently as possible. If that means working more, of course, if you're going up against China, you have no choice. You have to work more.
Yeah, I'll ask this question.
Hmm.
I'm not. I have some views on it, but I
Yeah.
think your views would be a lot more interesting. Which is, I think we as Indians tend to celebrate too often at too little accomplishments. Okay, like for example,
Sure.
if you take the United States
Hmm.
from 1776 until today, okay,
Yeah.
they have a they have a head start in terms of having the ability to form their government on their terms,
Hmm.
internal politics aside. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
almost close to 200, 250 years of progress
Hmm.
in some direction or the other. All, like I said, all negative alien forces aside. Okay.
Yep.
Now India has only 75 years,
Hmm.
okay, of independence. 75 years of independence. My question is, looking at how we have gone from a $958 GDP per capita in around, I don't know if my numbers are correct, but I will say that in the 1950s, 1960s, it was somewhere around 900, $958,
Yep.
all the way till where we are today.
Hmm.
Okay, it is great progress. Okay, but are we losing sight of where we want to be? And that is a cultural problem, because of which we are more interested in celebrating the present rather than looking at the future.
Venerating the past, celebrating the present, but not focusing enough upon setting targets for the future. Absolutely, 100% agreed.
You're almost,
We
it's almost like
we lack a
you're
mission
defining
statement.
India. Yeah, it's like you're almost defining India in that sentence. Venerating the past, celebrating the present, ignoring the future. Like, यार दर्द होता है सुन के.
Trust me, मुझे भी होता है, but yeah, I think it's a reasonably accurate description.
I completely agree. And in terms of driving the notion of, see, I think one of the very interesting things that has come out of India over the last 10 years is our approach to digital. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, it's a very interesting path that India has taken in terms of the US was able to build global influence through the allocation of capital.
Hmm.
China is now able to build influence in the world because of its infrastructure building initiatives.
Hmm.
For a very long time, people felt that these were the only two approaches you could take. For a long time, people felt that capital allocation was the only approach you could take. Then China came with the Belts and Highways initiative, and people felt, okay, I can also do that. India has come up with a third approach in terms of, low cost population scale software, which has actually transformed how many things in this country are actually operated, in my opinion. Okay. Where do you think technology and innovation, scientific progress actually drives up prosperity in terms of market outcomes, in terms of research output, and in terms of population productivity?
It helps, but I would argue that it is a little bit overrated the world over, and especially so in India. What holds us back in terms of being able to drive, say, for example, an efficient public distribution system is not being hampered by technology. Aadhaar is not what is holding us back over there. So this worshipping at the feet of technological deployment to help set up better systems is not an incorrect approach, but it certainly is an incomplete approach. This is where the state capacity of software on the human side, social skills, and the ability to do effective project management with good quality leadership is what is missing. So to say that it is technology and technology is the only thing that hampers us is a
No,
wrong
no,
way of
I, I,
thinking
I,
about
I
it.
agree.
I'm
I
not
would
saying you
not.
are. I'm saying that's the approach that India seems to bring to the table. Aadhaar आ गया तो सब कुछ ठीक हो जाएगा. It'll help, sure, but the fact that you might have a government employee who will skip a couple of steps in a process that has been drawn up to enroll somebody in Aadhaar is the bigger problem. But technology is a necessary but not at all a sufficient condition. And I would argue that we need to focus more on this in terms of providing services by the government.
And even in a certain sense, if you take a look at technology also,
Hmm.
uh, I'm not like you said. I don't think it's the be all and end all because there are deeper cultural problems. Like I'll give you a very silly example. Okay,
Yeah.
you order you order from Swiggy or Zomato. Okay,
Hmm.
the notion of service
Yeah.
is not there. I'm not criticizing anybody, but I'm just calling out that it's a cultural problem. Okay,
Hmm.
that the respect for the job, the respect for the economic output that you're actually delivering, and the
Hmm.
respect for the market is not there in the way that the agents inside that ecosystem. That's the attitude that they are actually displaying, right?
Hmm.
You get food that's actually not packaged well. You're getting food that's actually been mishandled. You're getting delivery people or agents now that's become even more digital, but that's separate. Where I think there is a like how we used to have a license Raj, right?
Hmm.
I think today we have sort of an entitlement Raj, where we feel that uh, I'm I am doing this job out of my personal luxury, and that the corporation has to come and thank me every single day for my valued presence and my continued support. Instead of maybe I'm even getting this wrong. What should the relationship between an agent in a corporate market ecosystem and the corporation and the government be like from a cultural standpoint?
Um, Couple of issues over here that I would think we need to delineate. When we say working for a corporate organization, such as, say, for example, Swiggy, are we talking about full-time employees? Are we talking about gig workers? And the relationship that you have with your employer might change depending upon what kind of
The nature
employment
of
you
the work.
have.
Yeah.
Right. So, as a full-time employee, my attitude towards my organization, and as a gig worker, my attitude towards the organization that has hired me might be different,
Correct.
and for a whole variety of different reasons.
Agreed.
So that's one issue. But second, in general, the fact that Indians have a sense of entitlement, sure, and that manifests itself in a variety of different ways. It manifests itself at the family level in terms of how we expect, say, for example, our parents to provide for us. Could be something as simple as getting a glass of water while you're studying. Could be something slightly more complicated in terms of how we will make sure that apna angan is clean, but the road outside is not. So the entitlement that we feel in terms of Mai Baap Sarkar is problematic both from the demand and the supply side. Sure, the government overreaches in terms of what it tells us to do, but we also expect far too much from our own government. Some of our sense of civic responsibility simply does not exist. वो सरकार करेगी, अपना काम नहीं है. And finally, the status that we seek in society is often a function of the job that we do. And that resentment that you see quite often in society is because certain sections of society do tend to feel that, boss, we are not getting the kind of respect that deserve is perhaps the wrong word to use. But what I'm
We
trying to
should be
say is blue
afforded.
collar workers simply don't have the same status. Yeah, absolutely. So the rudeness that you see when, say, for example, a family goes out for a meal in a restaurant is very different from the behavior that the same family will choose to participate in if that restaurant is placed abroad rather than in India.
Correct. Yeah.
So I keep coming back to that word culture, but how to change the culture in order to drive better economic outcomes is a challenge that India has never been able to solve.
And just to round up the state capacity section of our conversation so far, if I were to make you, I don't know what the role inside the government is. If I make you policy in chief,
Hmm.
chief of policy or whatever,
Hmm.
what are the aspects of state capacity libertarianism that you would prioritize to actually build India forward in a very structured, in a very deep way?
Wow. Okay. That is a brilliant question. If I were a policymaker in India, how would I use principles of state capacity libertarianism to drive better outcomes? Drive a culture of hiring a much better bureaucracy and making sure that the bureaucracy is both rewarded and punished. I'll come back to the Singapore example. The idea that the toppers from a university are selected to go into bureaucracy, a career related to bureaucracy, is a magnificent idea. Those guys are paid an insane amount of money. They have significant punishments waiting for them if they are caught on charges of corruption. But you basically in Singapore, the culture is if you're the best, you're going to work for the government.
Yeah.
In India, if you can't get any other job, then you become a teacher. If you can't get any other job, doesn't matter how long you work towards succeeding in it, you try and write the UPSC. but you're not filtering out the best and the brightest. So if you want to focus on the first three words of the phrase state capacity libertarianism, if you are going to charge people with dispensing libertarian services from the government, no matter how oxymoronic that sounds, first make sure that you have the capability amongst the people to deliver such service. So the first thing I want to begin with is figuring out how to improve the quality of the bureaucracy. And quality doesn't just mean education, it means a risk taking mindset that drives towards excellence and is willing to take risks. Easy for me to say that this is what I want to do. The how of it, I will happily admit, I'm not quite sure about right now.
Just on a side note,
Mhm.
have you read about the early Swatantra Party that was there during
Of
the
course.
early days of? So,
Yes.
I don't know how many people are aware of that. Do you think many people are aware of the party?
I hope they are. C. Rajgopalachari is a name that many more people in India should know, and not just in terms of the title that he held, but in terms of the culture that he tried to promote both in Tamil Nadu and in the rest of the country. Swatantra Party, and not just Swatantra Party, this is a wonderful rabbit hole to go down into. But names such as B.P. Adarkar, names such as B.R. Shenoy, names such
B.R.
as
Shenoy.
Rajgopalachari,
Yeah, yeah.
and people who could have taken India in a completely different direction in terms of our economics and therefore our politics in the 1950s. These three names, more people should know about. Absolutely.
Isn't it wild that it's never even mentioned in any of our curriculum? Like I think it's wild.
Completely. So history is written by the victors, and unfortunately, therefore, you're not going to see much of Siraj Gopalchari. That just is an inconvenient but accurate truth.
And just to wrap up the Swatantra, because we were talking about state capacity and all these things, I just
Yeah.
went into that. I'm reading a book called In Search of an Opposition by I think Aditya Balasubramaniam. He's at
Okay.
University of New South Wales, and he's
Hmm.
written an excellent book on the origins and the visions of the Swatantra Party
Hmm.
back in the day. So I hope to get him on the show sometime. But I just want to wind it up by saying that why do you think what is it that the founders of the Swatantra Party actually got right in terms of a core problem as to why this alternative was required for the way that the state was being formed in the early days of independent India?
Markets, they place, I would argue, primacy on markets rather than government. And I wish this was something that we had seen through. So whether it is the whole wage goods argument that emanated in the middle of the 1940s, whether it is the emphasis on providing employment via manufacturing rather than the route that we choose to go down. Every time I think about or read about issues such as this, I'm primarily filled with a sense of regret. But for God knows how many different sets of events in the 1950s, India could have charted such a completely different path.
Agreed.
And I risk sounding like a parrot by now because this must be the, I don't know, 10th time I've used the word culture. But part of the reason this happened is both because the people in charge at that point of time, and I would argue Indian society de-emphasizes business. The, how we think about, say, for example, the word dhanda, we use it to mean prostitution. Dhande wali aurat hai. So dhanda doesn't have a good connotation in our world. Bollywood has the line "dhanda hai par sorry ganda hai par dhanda hai." Nehru famously has said, "Don't speak of profit to me; it is a dirty word." So the idea that you're in business and earning a profit is somehow seen as being bad in our country. So part of the reason that Rajgopalachari and his ideas did not gain much traction, sure, it may have been because of the politics of that time, but also is because of the demand that comes from the culture that is India. We haven't venerated or celebrated businesses and business people in our country. That should change.
I am I I'm really thinking hard about this because because prosperity without freedom is pointless, and freedom without prosperity is purposeless, right? And
Wonderful. Yeah.
and I think what happens is that there is always this quest for a dichotomy कि मुझे प्रोग्रेस चाहिए, मेरे को फ्रीडम चाहिए, बट प्रॉस्पेरिटी के कॉस्ट पे मैं करूँगा, ओके. And or they will say, I want prosperity, I want progress, but I will do it at the cost of the other thing, right? So there is always this trade-off mindset when it comes to prosperity and progress, okay. So when we look at startup India, when we look, not startup India as a policy, but I'm talking about startups in India,
Mhm.
You have a young demographic, you have people more interested in taking risks, more interested in not working for traditional corporations, but rather learning the craft and going out and building large successful companies. But there are still deep rooted problems in the sense of how the economic policies are actually structured for these companies. Because even if you build these companies, okay, the state comes and takes a large chunk of it once you're trying to sell it off, right?
Yep.
Which is why you have problems where people are actually starting companies in India, but people who are interested in funding them go and say that you get redomiciled to either Singapore or in Delaware, okay?
Yep.
And
Yep.
all the profits are drained out of India. So there is a brain drain, there is an economic drain. Even people who want to stay in India, India is losing out because it's not progressing aggressively enough in these sort of sectors.
Yep.
Because of which I think there is a continuation in people who are saying like, yeah, I'm staying back in the country. I'm building
Mhm.
for the country. I'm building inside the country. Okay. But the state still looks at business, still looks at profit in a very, very dirty lens. And they are, for all their aggression, for all their bravado, etc., this is the one area where the people want change. Okay.
Yep.
Why is it not coming, in your opinion?
Because, well, lots of different things. But first, by definition, bureaucracy has been, and if you take a look at how slow reforms have been in terms of both design and implementation, 1991 was a start, but we are nowhere near the finish when it comes to reforms.
Correct.
Bhagwati and Panagri have an excellent book called Tryst with Destiny, in which the main section, in fact, is a section which speaks about so-called track to reforms, which still have to be completed. Bureaucrats have been reluctant to give up on the power that they have over the structure of the economy. Best exemplified by, say, for example, our reluctance to reform labor laws. Speak to any industrialist today, and they will tell you about how difficult it is to hire a large number of workers, and worse, be able to fire some of them if conditions so demand. So whether it is an Industrial Disputes Act, whether it is a Factories Act, and I can go on and on about the number of acts that we have to so-called protect labor in our country, they end up making it worse for labor in the long run, simply because people are reluctant to start large-scale firms. So the answer to the question, what is it that holds us back? It is a reluctance of the bureaucrats to cede control. And I go back to our culture and the idea that we have a Mai Baap Sarkar. So bureaucrats aren't willing to supply freedom. And I would argue Indians aren't willing to demand enough freedom from the government. So to analyze the market for changing culture, both from a supply and demand perspective, we are hampered.
And let's we'll move to the next section of the conversation, which dovetails perfectly, which is, I think the most important ideas I've learned in the last 10 years
Mhm.
have almost a majority of them have come from econ. They have come from complexity, and they have come from computer science. Okay,
Come from what, sorry?
computer science.
Computer science, okay.
I think the way that econ is almost fascinating when I feel that econ is amazing once you go into it in a self-learning mode, because
Yes.
there is a history, there is a tradition, there is a philosophy that you're actually trying to really. It doesn't matter whether you're able to model it or not. It's the principles behind that really affect you, because you're able to think both in micro and macro. So you have to be
Yep.
able to zoom in and you have to be able to zoom out. You have to be able to understand agent interactions and stuff like that, right?
Yep.
You are currently a professor, and if I were to say that, hey, I'm going to open the Econ for Everyone University, and Ashish is going to with Ashish, and
Mhm.
Ashish now has a complete clean slate to rethink how economics is actually taught. I'll be specific to Indians.
Mhm.
Okay, how would Ashish structure this curriculum?
Especially in the age of chat GPT, this is a fairly easy job. If you give people basic training in, I would say, 6 to 7 principles of microeconomics and 3, what I refer to as big picture questions in macroeconomics, and then say, all right, this is enough. Now go and explore the world. It would be enough, with one major caveat, which this is a bit of a frustration and a sore point for me. So I'm going to go off on a bit of a rant. Us professors of economics, we tell people that it is important to learn economics, but we fail to explain what for. Economics is the means to an end. Economics is what teaches you how to live a better life. The definition of better might change person to person. As the definition goes, it's up to you to choose what you want out of your life. Once you have chosen what you want out of your life, how to go about getting it is where economics really comes into play. economics is not about memorizing diagrams and equations and solving problems at the end of a chapter. Economics is about learning how to use the tools and principles of economics to drive better outcomes, however you define the word better, in both your own life and in your society. So economics isn't a subject that you master. Economics is a subject that you apply. And what do you apply? One insight that I would want every Indian to gain, and I'm limit myself to just one, is understand that the world and life is a non-zero sum game. When you do something in terms of a transaction, you benefit, so does the other party. The more we do of it, the richer the world gets. I would argue one thing that holds us back as a society and a culture is we have a very zero sum mindset. मेरे को जीतने के लिए तेरे को हारना जरूरी है. Entrance exam अगर हम दोनों लिखेंगे, तो for me to win, you have to lose. That mindset needs to change. And to me, if I have to teach people economics, and if there's just one idea that I want to restrict myself to, it'll be this. Understand that life is a non-zero sum game.
Absolutely, because I think if you read, in my opinion, if you read any of the great texts, any of the great papers, it's almost as if they are telling you how do you embody the best ideas in yourself, work on that, and see how it actually affects society at large. And when you don't have any of the other masala that is added to any econ curriculum in terms of what are the research outcomes you're doing for your professor or whatever,
Right.
I think it is very unfair that economics is actually called the dismal science. It's actually more of an awakening science. Because, for example, my favorite economics anecdote is there is an interview between Peter Robinson and Thomas Sowell. And, Sowell apparently was still a Marxist when he went to do his PhD at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
And then he went to work, I think, at the Federal Reserve or some other government, and he saw how ineffective it was that he immediately changed his views and he became like a complete capitalist, saying that this shit is not going to work at all. It's not going to fly. It doesn't make sense. I don't know why I'm even supporting this.
Correct.
So I think one point, if I may add to the layering that you provided in terms of a curriculum, it is use the tools of economics, the principles, the ideas, and the frameworks to form your own worldview. Then go out and test that worldview, wherever it may be, and see whether it holds consistency or not. And where it is consistent, understand why it's consistent. Where it's inconsistent, understand why it's inconsistent, and make changes suitable in whatever dimension of better you feel is appropriate. So you have a better model of understand what works for you, what works for your compatriot, and what works for society as a whole.
Yeah.
Why is this kind of approach is self-discovery a better way of learning economics, or the curriculum model better in terms of learning economics?
Right now, I would say with a caveat, the self-discovery is a better way, but that's because my tribe, myself included, we are failing. We don't teach people the point of economics. People will respond to their incentives. There is no such thing as a free lunch. The world is a non-zero sum game. If you want to communicate to society at large, prices are an amazing way to communicate. Markets sometimes fail, and you should take, when possible, the long-term view. Time matters, in other words. This is a worldview. Now, sure, disagree with this worldview if you like, but if you do, go out and ask, does this worldview help you understand why people behave the way they do? And if it does, then perhaps this economic model works.
Test the hypotheses out.
Yeah, but this unfortunately is not what people think of when they think of economics. They think of indifference curves and diagrams and equations and textbooks. But no, sure, I'm not saying that is not a part of economics, but 1.4 billion Indians need to understand that economics is this, what I just described, and learn how to apply it in the context of their own life. We don't do it often enough as teachers.
I don't know if somebody else has said this, but I generally tell people that if you really think of economics, economics is not just the wealth of nations. Economics is also the theory of moral sentiments.
Moral sentiments, absolutely.
And Russ Roberts, I have to give a shout out to Russ Roberts' beautiful book on how Adam Smith can change your life. It's an amazing book. I think I revisit that book every now and then. And so this is a free shout out. I don't even know if that's the correct term, but shout out to Russ Roberts and his incredible book on how Adam Smith can change your life. And I think there are some interesting ideas that you touched upon non-zero sum and all of that.
Mhm.
And I have a general feeling that those ideas are not generally covered in standard economics curricula, right?
Yep.
And so I'll start from first principles. What makes it into an economics curricula, and what doesn't make into an economics curricula?
You asked me to describe the state of affairs as it is today.
Yeah, you can. That's a great place to start.
We have received wisdom that textbooks ought to be in a particular way, that the syllabus ought to be a particular way. Unfortunately, when you're designing a syllabus for a university, you very rarely ask, what is the best thing to teach? We assume that the best university in the world is teaching the best thing possible, and we say, let's copy it. So we've created a culture where every university the world over, and certainly universities in India, have the same syllabus where economics is concerned. उन्होंने किया तो ऐसा ही होना चाहिए. And if you ask me, part of the blame must be laid at the feet of Paul Samuelson. The worst thing he ever did was write a book called Foundations of Economic Analysis. Because today, if you have to have a master's degree in economics, you must be able to solve, say, for example, problems in microeconomics by making it seem as if you're talking about mathematics. So we have a syllabus today which is very much oriented towards what standard textbooks teach you, without asking, is this really what economics is for? यार तुम अगर say for example telecom management में MBA करने वाले हो, तो what does it matter to you what Roy's entity says? What does it matter to you whether you can find the point of tangency between a budget line and indifference curve? Why should that be economics? What are the incentives of the people who have designed the new telecom policy of 1999? Were those incentives what we needed to have in place for the best outcomes for the people of India? Is a better question to ask. Is this ever discussed when you teach economics to people who manage telecom in India? No. And so, of course, they're going to hate what they are taught in economics and say, boss, I never want to touch the subject again. Because what they think of in terms of economics is not what economics is. That's a tragedy for times.
And so, in your opinion, what are I
Hmm?
think, what do you think are 5, 6 key ideas in economics which are under taught, underrepresented, that you think should come more into the mainstream? And to choose your words, I
Hmm.
think access to those ideas, access to
Yep.
those mental models,
Yep.
can transform culture, one step at a time.
I'm happy to repeat them. And like I said, the rest of my life, if I do nothing except repeat these ideas, that's more than fine by me. Incentives matter. When you're evaluating something, ask why people take the decisions that they do. So this is a very weird way to explain this, but in Dil Chahta Hai, when Amir tells his dad that, hey, I'm in love with Preeti Zinta, but I don't know why she's not doing what I would want her to do. And the dad says, when somebody says something or does something, uski koi wajah hoti hai. Great line. More people should adopt it. What is your incentive for doing what you have? Once you understand the incentive, you can understand and predict fairly easily what this person is likely to do. So understand that the world works by incentives because all of us respond to incentives. Speaking of Tyler, is an entire book just on this idea. Discover Your Inner Economist is basically 300-400 pages of saying, hey, incentives matter. One. Second, nothing is ever for free. Opportunity costs are everywhere. तुमने अगर ये किया तो तुम ये नहीं कर पाओगे. Understand this and value it. So, to explain this point, Marcus Aurelius used to have an object on his desk which he would refer to as memento mori, which means boss, tu marne wala hai. Okay, so why have such a depressing thought on your desk? Because your time is limited. Figure out how to use it better. So the idea that nothing is for free, most importantly, your time is not for free. Learn to value it. Two principles. Third, trade is a non-zero sum game. What is sometimes referred to as a double thank you moment. When I walk into, say, for example, a chai tapri and I buy a cup of chai, I give that 10 rupees to that chai wala, I get a cutting chai. I'm happy, the chai wala is happy. Who has lost out in this transaction? Nobody has. Humanity is defined by the fact that we trade with other humans. No other species in the world gets richer by trading with each other. The initial thought is one of suspicion and distrust. Our thought is, boss, I don't know you, but I want to buy something from you. Can I? Celebrate this, double down on it. That's what makes us who we are, humans, the fact that we trade with each other. Fourth, markets work. Stop distrusting markets. Markets are awesome. Markets are what makes us who we are today. And therefore, prices matter. So the minute you as a government try to cut down a price or say that this must be the minimum price, you live in a world that doesn't work the way it is supposed to. Prices communicate important information. My favorite example about this is minimum attendance in a classroom. Because that's the exact same thing as a price floor. As a professor, if the students want to tell me, boss, you suck, but we force them to stay in class, then they're not able to say that you suck. So don't set price floors or price ceilings. They're not good. But that being said, sometimes markets fail. There is asymmetry of information. There are externalities. There is a case of moral hazard. So sure, there is a role for government, but keep it as limited as possible. It's taken me 5 minutes to explain this, but this drummed repeatedly into everybody's head is pretty much all the economics that you need to know.
Wow. I'll take one thread from the ideas that you have shared, and that is in terms of prices. People have a very monomaniacal perspective on prices. Prices
Yeah.
is basically dam, dam is basically rupees, rupee is basically cost.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How do we expand the definition of what a price is in the first place? What is price as a concept?
I'm going to shamelessly copy Alex and Tyler's definition. Price is an incentive wrapped up in a signal. So price is an incentive for you to buy more of something if it has become cheaper or less of something if it has become dearer. And the mirror image on the supply side. But it is also a way to communicate to society that, boss, this thing has become more scarce. Figure out something else that you can use instead. Or, boss, this has become cheaper. Use a lot more of it. To give you a very concrete example, which everybody will be in one way or the other familiar with, why are Uber rides so expensive at 4 a.m. on the 1st of January? What is being communicated to you? What is being communicated to you is, hey, drivers are in short supply over here. So if you want to hire a driver for the next half an hour, you're going to have to pay through your nose. But at the same time, this is also an extremely powerful way to tell a lot of drivers that, hey, rather than party with your friends and family on New Year's Eve, choose to work as a driver. You'll earn a lot more money. हम सब गाली देते हैं जब Uber पे अपने को 2x सर्च प्राइस दिखता है. But what most of us fail to realize is it's the same thing that allows certain drivers to choose to be drivers on at 4 a.m. on the 1st of January. Is Uber calling up people on the demand and supply side and saying, boss, aisa hai? No, they're just showing you the price. The price is talking. One part of the market is becoming very angry at what the price is saying, but the other part is becoming very happy. And price is therefore communicating to the world. So what are prices? Prices are incentives wrapped up in signals. And it's important to realize that prices speak to both the supply and the demand side.
Absolutely. And, I think you also spoke briefly about price discrimination as a problem, right?
Yeah.
And, can you elaborate a little more on that for me and the audience, if that is okay?
The whole world over, we live in a society which uses price discrimination. If you want to be a citizen of the 21st century, then by definition, you have to understand price discrimination. When Amazon, say, for example, says that for the next 10 minutes, this good is 10% off, what it is saying is there are certain people who will choose to buy only if the price is low enough. So we just bought a new 55-inch TV for our living room. It wasn't necessary. We had a perfectly well-functioning TV, but we said, all right, during the whatever that sale is called, we will wait during that sale and buy a good TV. But if our TV had broken down in the month of August, then we would have had no choice but to replace it. Then we wouldn't have waited for a discount. How does Amazon understand that, hey, a certain section of society needs to buy a TV? A certain section of society is willing to wait to buy the TV. What it does is it says, all right, this is the price at which you can buy. Every now and then it will be on sale. So what we are using is a form of price discrimination to figure out, can I afford to sell to certain people at a higher price, but to other people at a lower price? This simple example applied in the context of, say, for example, movie theaters is price discrimination except by time of day. This principle applied in the case of a plane is price discrimination, but on the basis of first class seats or economy seats. How do I, as a seller, understand that I want to charge the highest price possible that each consumer is willing to pay, but without making it seem unfair or quote unquote discriminatory? That's the art and science of price discrimination. Whether you're a seller or a buyer, you need to understand that this A is happening as a buyer, should be happening as a seller, and how to learn to use it to your best ends possible. That is the point of price discrimination.
I think that is amazing, and it just sort of took me back to our initial points about discussing on how startups are actually trying to get built and make impact in the Indian economy.
Yep.
And I think pricing is something that the West has largely mastered because they rely on the principles of
Yep.
how to price something very well, because they understand the culture, they understand the audience, they understand the purchasing power parity, and they understand the ability to actually they have significant access to data that tells them why people buy something.
Yep.
Okay, and they tie that to a certain cultural milieu, so to speak.
Mhm.
For Indians to be able to build large, successful companies, they also have to be able to master these many dimensions of pricing, and also be able to, really accept that people are not rational all the time.
Yes.
One aspect is that you will rationally wait for 6 months for that sale to purchase the TV.
Correct.
And the other side is that, see, the TV breaks and you immediately go buy a new one because you need a TV. So,
Right.
do you think price discrimination is almost like a bug in our response to price discrimination is almost like a bug in our own evolutionary system, where we are unable to distinguish between two types of rationality?
Whether it is a bug or a feature is a
I agree
fascinating question.
that I accept, but I just used bug because it's the first. Because rationality, in my opinion, is a very it's very nuanced, but you largely have a concrete picture of what are rational choices through principles of logic. Okay, but when I am able to generally when we say something is mirrored, we generally say that it's the opposite. Okay, what price discrimination does is that it actually mirrors my choices, but it shows my choices as largely the same and not an inversion.
Mhm.
It's still the same TV. It's
Right.
still that same cost. Okay, it's a lower cost. I accept it. Okay, but the need that makes us remove the card from our pocket to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's what I specifically mean.
Oh, absolutely. And like I said, when I say bug or a feature, we might end up talking about behavioral economics. But are we susceptible to responding to external stimuli in terms of prices? Of course. Can sellers utilize their knowledge of how the mind works to make it more likely that we will say yes? Equally, of course. What we owe ourselves as consumers is to realize that this is happening all the time. And sometimes you might choose to be fooled by it, but you should know that you're being fooled. That is so. To give you one concrete example of this, the fact that the medium-sized tub of popcorn costs only 10 rupees less than the full-size tub of popcorn is, to use a phrase from economics, an irrelevant alternative. And all of us end up doing the mental calculation कि यार बस 10 रुपए ज्यादा देके डबल पॉपकॉर्न मिल रहा है तो ले लेते हैं बड़ा वाला बॉक्स वो 10 रुपए वाला कम is a trick used by the marketeer. Nobody wants you to buy the medium-sized tub of popcorn. The weird part is I know this, I teach this, but I still buy the large tub of popcorn. So I am being fooled, but I know that I'm being fooled. And then I say, all right, you know what? Even if I get a minor tummy ache, sitting with a really huge tub of popcorn is a point of going to watch a movie. So I'm fooled, but knowingly so.
It's
You should
almost
know
like
what you're getting into.
it's almost like the tummy ache is actually priced into the price of the ticket and the popcorn and the evening. Yeah.
The market for popcorn
Yeah.
is efficient. Yes.
Absolutely. If there was ever one. uh, I am really interested in talking about this last bit on pricing so we can actually tie it together. What do you think Indian entrepreneurs and startup founders need to understand in terms of pricing for Indians? In terms of certain principles to consider, because we already have the Western playbook for how to actually price things. But since we are also talking about culture on a whole, and we're talking about state capacity, libertarianism, pro-progress, pro-prosperity, taking those into consideration, how should they think of pricing?
I'm not sure how to answer this question because I'm not an expert in terms of marketing and prices. The one book that I would recommend, simply because I enjoyed reading it and helped me understand the psyche of the Indian consumer, is a book written by a lady called Rama Bijapurkar, who's written a book called We Are Like That Only, which goes some way. I won't say I'm an expert at all, but it helped me understand the psyche of the Indian consumer. And the one thing that I feel relatively safe in saying is the Indian consumer seems to be more value conscious than most other societies.
Correct.
Whether that is still true, whether a young Indian in the year 2023 will be equally value conscious as when that book was written, sometime in the late 1990s, perhaps not. But the Indian psyche seems to be one of trying to find out if I'm getting a good deal or not. But more than that, because it's not my area of expertise, pricing and marketing in the context of India, I don't think I can say much more than this.
Perfectly understandable. I actually brought that up because I think that's a perfect segue into a certain fallacy that most experts as well as most common people fall into, which is the ability to predict the future based on past models. We
Yeah.
have something that is actually worked. We understand, we break it down till there is absolutely nothing left but the atoms inside it. We understand that this is the way, okay?
Right.
And then we accept it as gospel and we try to sort of force fit it onto any problem and say that, yeah, for example, the Samuelson thing that you said. Like,
Right.
because when they ask what is the difference between a Harvard Econ curriculum and, XYZ college Econ curriculum, they'll say that curriculum में difference ही नहीं है जो हार्वर्ड के इकोनॉमिक्स डिपार्टमेंट में सिखाते हैं वो curriculum मैं खुद इधर फॉलो करता हूँ, right? And that model is unique over there and it fits that particular set of sensibilities and that set of audience.
Yeah.
And here we are actually tone deaf to it and we say that because that is the model that has been historically followed, we will follow this model only.
Correct.
Why is this bias existing within the mind of any person? That the past predicts the future. Or the past has the ability to tell you what the future might look like, which is even worse in my opinion.
Well, I'll try and give you the best possible argument in defense of this idea and then explain why it's a problem. What else have you got? You can only predict the future by looking at the past. So, in a sense, it's understandable that, hey, if I want to find out what is going to happen tomorrow, I take a look at what has happened in the past. But as I'm fond of telling my students every time I teach them the value at risk concept, I am not going to die tomorrow because I have not died so far.
Yeah.
Is an obviously incorrect statement. But hey, if I'm going to use the fact that I've been alive for 42 years, then I'm going to predict that I'm going to be alive tomorrow as well. So using the past to predict the future is understandable, but by definition, in certain cases, limited. And by the way, the reason I use that example when I'm teaching value at risk is because one of the limitations of value at risk is we get this false sense of security that the world is never going to be worse because it was not so bad in the last 100 years. But by that logic, Lehman Brothers should never have declared bankruptcy in 2008 because they never declared bankruptcy up until that point of time. So having said that, all right, what else have you got to use? It's always going to be the past. There are limitations. The first is the fact that the world is inherently unpredictable. So sure, if you want to use the past as an indicator too, but recognize that the future by definition is always going to be more complicated than the past. Number one. Number two, the past is not the same for everybody. Something that you hinted at when you said, why do models that work in America don't work in India? It's because we come from a different culture. It's because we have different beliefs. It's because we have different value systems. That fact is unfortunately not recognized often enough. Keynes said that an economist needs to have a wide variety of skills to be thought of as an economist. And I would argue that an economist from that line of thinking needs to understand the fact that culture plays as much of a role as does your model. An Indian responding to a change in price might behave differently than an American responding to a change in price. So we have this idea, say, for example, that it is inauspicious to buy something between the festival of Ganesh Chaturthi and Diwali. If you're an American economist and you say 5% discount in a particular good leads to a 10% increase in demand, yes, maybe, but not during those 3 months of the Indian calendar. So can I use data from India's past to predict India's future? Turns out no, because the context is dependent on our religious beliefs. So no, I don't think the future is best understood by always and only looking at the past. Use it as one of your variables, but not the only thing.
That is such a wild example because it's almost like, it's almost like a resistance is futile sort of an argument. Right? because culture, I understand that it's hilarious, but my mind is blown by it. I'm being open because you have a culture where it is considered inauspicious to buy anything within that period of time. And it's almost like the corporation is pressing the button to see that what incentives can I give you to change that behavior.
Correct.
So it's almost very weird in the sense that instead of respecting that behavior and incentivizing it accordingly, okay, where they can say something as, this is a very, very stupid idea that, you pay a low cost now, you get the delivery afterwards. Or
Wow.
something like that, okay, where I have an assurance contract to actually deliver it to you. You give me a
Right.
down payment. A down
Right.
payment is not even a full payment. So
Right.
again, there is a problem where if I will, it's even the purchasing capacity of these corporations that actually push them to do this, right? What are my margins on it? That's the core question. Will I get hit if it's a 5% discount? Is
Right.
the audience budging? No. Let's push it to 7. Still no response? No. Let's push it to 10. Let's push it at what? It's almost like, at what point will that audience break? And
Right.
once that audience breaks, that culture breaks.
Yeah.
And there's no respect for that culture because they understand that is the only model that works and I can apply brute force capital to break that problem. So
Correct.
I think this is incredible. I think somebody needs to write something about this in my opinion. Okay. So I will leave it at that. I will come back to this in the sense that there is a deeper problem in understanding the future through the past, because a large part of our cultural understanding is that nothing in the past, everything that has worked has only worked in the past. Okay, nothing in the future will work because the quality of people are bad, which is an insane argument. Okay, and I will give a concrete example for this in the sense that if you take sports for example, you talk to anybody. So I at one point came from a home where there were 5 generations of people living. Okay, so I was there, my dad was there, his brother was there, my granddad was there, and my great granddad was in the same house.
Wow.
If you asked everybody what is the quality of cricket, everybody felt that it's coming down. Okay, my granddad would say Bradman was great. Okay, my dad would say Kapil Dev is the greatest.
Right.
My dad's brother would say that I think Azhar was great. I don't know if he believes that, but he would say Azhar was great. And then I would say that Sachin is the greatest. If you talk to my brother, he'll say that there's nobody like Kohli. Okay. The problem is that people hold a consistency of belief, okay, without accepting what the ground level data is.
Correct.
Right. So people like my granddad clearly know that the performance standards, the metrics, everything basically say that a Virat Kohli is more technically sound, much fitter, okay, and much better as a player because he's playing more cricket in different conditions at a much greater length of time.
Right.
But what is the problem with nostalgia when it comes to accepting past models and trying to map that onto the future? You're comparing Bradman, who played in all those times, all that time ago, versus a Virat Kohli who's playing right now. Your models are simply not mapping onto reality. Why is that bug there in people's thinking?
Inertia and a fondness for what was familiar to you when you were either growing up or learning. So before I proceed any further, obviously the correct answer to your question about cricket is Sachin is the best ever. But when I say that, I'm revealing my age and when I grew up.
Exactly.
And it's exactly like you're saying. Maybe my nephew or somebody might say that, no, of course Kohli is better. Or in fact, these days, shayad Kohli ka bhi time gaya, no, Shubman Gill is the best.
Yeah.
But it's like you said, things change. Sure, the word cricket remains the same, but test matches are very different from one-day cricket. One-day cricket is very different from T20 internationals. League cricket is very different from cricket played for your national team or whatever it may be. But we grow up and we learnt about cricket and our opinions were formed in those formative years. And we choose to judge people by those standards. Those standards themselves have changed. Standards don't remain immutable. But it's surprisingly difficult to understand how this has itself changed over time. We live in a very rapidly changing world. So what we use as our metric to judge somebody needs to change with time. Then your answer will change with time. But we are very reluctant to change the metric, the yardstick by which we judge people.
Two points of note here. Okay. The first point is that you used a phrase that I will have a discussion with you if we have a conversation down the future, which is that the world is rapidly changing, and I am in that great stagnation school. Like, it's no such thing as rapid change that is happening. It's all too slow. Nothing is happening. Please don't use that word again. Like, at least in front of me. And I have gotten roasted. I have gotten yelled at. I have gotten told that is deeply untrue. But I am sticking to my guns because I had one thought experiment that I heard from Eric Weinstein, who said that if I took away every screen from your room, except for matters of design, how would you know that you're not living in 1950?
Great question. Yeah.
And that just broke a lot of things in my head. Ki, like, whenever I hear people talking about dizzying pace of technology, मैं बोलता हूँ क्या technology? Nixon declared war on cancer during his tenure. Nothing has moved. Nothing has happened. Now we've got in CRISPR, but that is a different argument altogether. That's a separate conversation. That's number one. Number two is, we touched upon nostalgia.
Yeah.
Do you think that nostalgia is the biggest roadblock or the biggest enabler of why people are obsessed with past models and trying to implement them into the future?
Absolutely. 100%. And I plead guilty to this myself.
Yeah.
I want to go back to how life was in the 90s, for example, as an emotion. I'm not saying it's possible. I'm not saying it's desirable. But I find myself hankering for how quote unquote awesome how life was in the 1990s.
Would you also say that I completely, absolutely, no worries, absolutely. Do you also believe it's because of this human infallibility syndrome where they feel that they can model the living shit out of anything?
Arrogance of the modeler. Yeah, absolutely.
Because I remember reading the synopsis of a book called Keynes versus Hayek, the debates that defined the future of economics, or some title like that. It's a very popular book. And Keynes was obsessed with, please correct me, you're the expert, but the general gist is this, that Keynes was obsessed and deeply believed that you have to have an economic system that is accurately modeled, or you should have some sense of a model that is deeply accurate, and that actually encompasses and captures all modes of interaction between man and market and state. And Hayek was like, that is a fool's errand because it is simply not possible, right? And somewhere I think Keynes won, and this modeler's mentality went into overdrive. It became like a super bug, like a super steroid, and everybody tried to model everything. And because everybody tried to model everything that was already there in our libraries, and because it's there in the library, people will pick that model and they'll try to force fit it somewhere.
Yep.
Like, it's almost like a self-citation wala problem. Do you believe that this is true, or am I getting something incorrect fundamentally? Or अगर आप बोलना चाहते हो कि यार you should think twice before talking, you should feel free to completely say that to me.
No. So, as a very amateur student of the history of economic thought, perhaps Keynes being described the way you did does him a little bit of disservice. But I don't say that because I object to what you're saying. And Hayek had, in a sense, the most difficult job of them all in economics. It was his job to explain to the rest of the economics profession that you, by definition, can never know. Markets are emergent.
Correct.
And the idea that you can have a central social planner who knows everything past, present, and future, and therefore can predict what the world is going to look like, is deeply fallacious. Where I not disagree, but where I'm unsure of is whether the blame should be laid entirely only at the feet of Keynes, or you want to take a look at people such as Frank Hahn, Arrow Debrew, in terms of the work that they did, Walra and his focus on Tatonement. So we're getting into very obscure areas of economics.
No, this is great. This is where we want to go.
The conceit that economics can model the world is sure something that Hayek argued against. And for that, not only do I have the greatest amount of sympathy and respect for Hayek, but that really is what economics is. When Adam Smith says the invisible hand, he's in effect saying what Hayek was saying. We don't know how it works, but it does. And the idea that we can somehow know is a deeply dangerous one. So from that perspective, yes, 100% in agreement with you.
So thank you very much for letting me down so gently by saying that as an amateur in economic history, I agree and I will do my work much better. Before we move to the next section, I just want to ask you, what do you think of the work of people like Deidre McCloskey and Joel Moykr?
Both of them are fantastic economists. In fact, I would argue both of them are outside of your conventional definition of what an economist ought to be. Deidre McCloskey, for many, many reasons, not just the work on economic theory, but both she and Joel Moykr are brilliant people. I wish more people read their works. When it comes to Deidre McCloskey, one request I have, especially of people who work with statistics, is you should read a work of hers called The Cult of Statistical Significance. Bourgeois Virtues is a book that everybody speaks about and well worth reading. But the amount that we have abused basic statistical theory is something that more people should learn about.
Just as a follow on to that, we are going to clip this out, so I'll be very
Mhm.
open. If you could give a brief primer on the life and work of Deidre McCloskey and Joel Moykr for somebody, can you? Stage is yours. You can just give that overview; it'll be helpful.
I'm not sure how to. It's difficult to condense both of their works. Think of Joel Mokyr as a person who helps you understand, and this is my description, so hopefully people will disagree and tell me why. Think of him as a way to understand how and why economics progresses and therefore society does. Think of Deirdre McCloskey as a person who helps you understand what it is about the underlying culture that both drives and hampers progress in economic society. Sorry, in economics and therefore in society. So, and it's interesting, I've never thought of both of them this way. But think of Mokyr as showing us what is possible, and think of Deirdre McCloskey as explaining to us why it isn't possible as rapidly as we would like it to be. To me, that's a good way of understanding both of their points of view. But this is a way to whet your appetite to learn more about them. If you're
Absolutely.
listening to this, learn more.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we are coming to the final couple of sections of our segments of our conversation. So, as you know, the podcast is called the Inductive Economy,
Mhm.
and I was having a very hard time even defining why I wanted to call it the Inductive Economy, which
Mhm.
clearly tells you I'm not a rational person. Because most people have a meaning behind why they do certain things, or at least try to have some semblance of strategy or understanding behind why they name such a thing. And I'll be open in admitting that I think Venkatesh Rao has an amazing post on the difference in the models of thinking, inductive versus reductive versus something. I'll post the link in the show notes and I'll also share it with you. But somewhere I felt like, going back to our point about the dependence on the past,
Mhm.
models of the past and using that as a vehicle to model the future. I felt that that is a very reductionist approach to
Mhm.
understand progress, to understand prosperity, to understand freedom. So I think you need to be able to think inductively as an alternative, because I think reductive thinking has become the standard, it's become the norm, it's become the status quo in terms of how to really think about these ideas. And I think the inductive economy or inductive reasoning is a way out of that trap that most people find themselves in. And being a trained, that's my amateur reasoning. I'll be open about it. Uh, but as a trained economist, as somebody who teaches economics and is an economics communicator, when I give you the words the inductive economy, what does that mean to you?
There are two ways to think about how to model the world. You can either say, hey, you know what? I'm going to ignore everything that I see around me. I'm going to go back to what I think ought to be the first principles of society. And without taking a look at empirics, without taking a look at how the world works, I'm simply going to say this is how the world ought to be. And then I can go out and say, I'm going to use this model and I'm going to force fit reality onto this model. If this model is not working out, it is because my understanding of reality is incomplete. My model is perfect. And I would argue that many economists today behave this way. The most famous model to come out of microeconomics, and it has since been applied to pretty much everything, is what is known as the Arrow-Debreu model, which is a model that was developed sometime in the 1950s and 1960s. And us economists, we insist on using our understanding or our disagreements with this framework to understand how the world works. Some economists, not all, say, hey, you know what, this is not how we are going to be. What we are going to do is we're going to go out and observe the world and ask why it behaves the way it does. And we're going to update our theory based on what we see of reality. Rather than say, if reality doesn't work the way our model predicts, then reality is wrong. The latter approach, observational economics, is, I would argue, a better way of trying to understand the world. As economists, we ought to be more humble and we ought to change our theories based on how reality behaves rather than insist that reality change because this is how our model predicts it ought to be. By the way, this is not an original strand of thought by any stretch of the imagination. Lots of different people in economics have worried about this very important methodological issue. Uh, I think it was Clover who has an entire essay on this topic on how economists are not focused enough on reality and focused far too much on their models. but it's a strand of thinking that I very deeply empathize.
I think what I am going to do after this conversation is really sit down and write my thoughts out on what does this mean and why am I framing it in this way. And I think you've given me a lot of interesting kindle to light that fire. So thank you very much for that, Ashish.
Fantastic.
I
Sure.
wanted to just touch on the last topic, which is what are your thoughts on the incompatibility of economic values and political opinion in India?
Political opinions will always supersede economic values. That's the tragedy of not just our times, but I would argue of any society. What will triumph is political necessities, not economic virtues.
And that's actually interesting because before during our pre-sync call we had this discussion, and one of the things that really strikes me is that people don't vote based on the assumption is that the Brian Kaplan has this great book called The Myth of the Rational
Myth of the rational voter. Yeah.
and parties put out these majestic manifestos saying that I will bring this reform, I will bring that reform, but at the end of the day I don't know what percentage of people really vote after reading those hundreds and thousands of pages that they actually publish. And and somewhere it's almost like they've made up their mind and something drastic has to happen for them to change their perspective. So on what basis do people actually have preferential votes?
Psychological affiliations, I would argue, more than economic reasoning. We do judge a book by its cover. The world lives, for the most part, in system one thinking in their brains. And so whatever appeals to that system one part of the brain is likelier to win you votes. This is true of politics all over the world. The economic model, by the way, to understand why not people do what they do, but why politicians do what they do, is a lovely paper called Distributive Politics and Economic Growth. This is a paper written by Alesina and Roderick, in which they explain that the higher the level of inequality in a society, the easier it is for a politician to promise redistribution and therefore be likelier to win elections. That's a very simple paraphrasing of their paper, but it works.
And this is Danny Roderick, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So thank you so much, Ashish. So we'll move into the next section. Thank you so much. So my first question to you, Ashish, is what is the one piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
Read more. If I could go back in time and speak to a younger Ashish, could be yesterday, could be 30 years ago, please read more. At the margin, one should always be reading more.
Amazing. Books that have changed the way that you think and engage with the world. What are they?
I'll nominate just two. There are quite a few. One is a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which helped me develop a love for philosophy and helped me understand how to be a thinker. I don't endorse everything that is written in that book, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. The second is a very weird reference, but the Mahabharata. I love the book because there is no clear delineation of good and evil. We live in a world where everybody has flaws, everybody has certain positive aspects. Is the biggest takeaway that I have taken from the Mahabharata. I love it.
Amazing. What annoys you about other people that you sometimes do yourself?
Procrastination and postponement of deadlines.
Perfect.
I have no moral right to be angry at other people for this because I am excellent at procrastinating. But yeah, it's a failing on my part.
My next question is tied to that. What's your go-to method for overcoming procrastination or writer's block?
Setting deadlines that entail other people agreeing to review my work. The pressure of not me having to finish something, but having asked for a favor from somebody and then not giving them the work to review makes me do it. The trouble is, yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. I'm so sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, the trouble is some people know that I use this method and they tend to be forgiving if I don't turn up on time, which has become a problem.
Understood. If you could time travel 25 years into the future, what are the three questions you would want answers to regarding the state of technology in society?
What a lovely question. Even if it is possible to elongate life, at what psychological and physiological cost? So, having a longer lifespan may not necessarily be a good thing. And what is it about our mental makeup that changes as a consequence of having a longer time span? Might we, in fact, end up being people with a lesser sense of urgency, and might that actually be a bad thing? So even elongating life may have significant opportunity costs. Number one. Number two, have we figured out how to make the world a safer place for developments in technology? Have we figured out a way to set a floor for, you know what, in terms of climate, in terms of nuclear war, things can't be worse than this benchmark? Have we gotten better at mitigating risks associated with technological development? And I'll cheat a little bit. And the third one, I'll refer to one of my favorite pieces of science fiction. Is 42 the correct answer?
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Uh, if you had to condense your life philosophy into one sentence, what would it be?
Stay curious. We die out as a species if we don't wonder what happens next.
What's a recent discovery or a piece of information that has blown your mind?
Hmm. It's not relatively recent. I learned about this some years ago, but it continues to blow my mind. China, between the years 2012 and 2016, poured more concrete in their country than the United States of America did in the entire 20th century.
Wow,
It's a mind boggling fact.
wow. Okay. What's the most valuable piece of advice you ever received and who gave it to you?
I wish I knew who said this to me. It, in fact, is the masthead on Econ for Everybody, my blog. I, I'm sorry, I don't know who to give credit to, but the phrase is learn better. And all of us need to end each day having learned a little bit better than yesterday. Wonderful advice.
Absolute. Right out of the words of Charlie Munger. Go to bed each day a little wiser than you were. Something to that effect.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly.
Absolutely. Uh, um, what's one daily habit or routine that has had a profound impact on your life?
For the last almost 3 years now, practicing Duolingo daily. Not so much because I've gotten better at French, which is a language that I'm trying to learn. I would say I'm still pretty bad at it, but it has taught me the power of habit formation. And I now try to use it to develop other habits. So the meta learning from developing a habit is my best learning.
And Ashish, my final question: what are three films you'd recommend our listeners to watch that's had a massive impact on you?
Wow, what a lovely question. Mm, three films that have had a massive impact. My first answer will be, and not for the reasons that you might think, Dil Chahta Hai. The reason I say this as an economist is because one weird thing about Dil Chahta Hai is it released on the 24th of July 2001. The date might not mean much to many people. It happens to be exactly 10 years to the day after Manmohan Singh made his famous budget speech of 1991. Dil Chahta Hai could only have been made after liberalization. And so therefore Dil Chahta Hai. One. Um, movies. Let's see. My benchmark for judging a movie is how entertaining it is, how informative it is, and how thought-provoking it is. So any science fiction movie, but I'd pick the original three Star Wars movies. Great storytelling, but also the optimism of science fiction. And therefore, Star Wars is a representation of science fiction movies. They show you what is possible. In fact, to go back to an earlier point, they're the opposite of trying to imagine the future by looking at the past.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
therefore, read and watch as much science fiction as you can, and we'll keep Star Wars as a placeholder.
Yeah.
Uh, third will be a weird reference, but any Rishikesh Mukherjee movie, but I'll go with Golmaal.
Superb.
Humanity is fundamentally good, and people are fundamentally good, and life is wonderful. Rishikesh Da espoused this philosophy in his movies, and it's something that I think all of humanity would do well to remember.
Ashish, I cannot begin to thank you on how much this conversation has inspired and brought such a smile on my face. And I am absolutely floored that you agreed to speak with me on this podcast. And Econ for everyone, I'll put the link in the show notes. It's an absolutely incredible experience to read your posts that come daily. And I've been following it for for quite some time, and thank you so much for being here and talking to me. And it's absolutely made. I think I'm not going to be this happy for a very long time. So thank you so much.
What a wonderful thing to say. Thank you so much, Vignesh. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you.
Thank you.